My girlfriend Ellie and I decided to change our surroundings and moved into a new house. It was a two-story house with a lovely renovation, located in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The evening of the move was exhausting. We unpacked only the essentials and, barely able to move our feet, went to bed. However, around 4 a.m., thirst woke me up. I quietly got up to avoid waking Ellie and went to the kitchen. While I was pouring water into a glass, I noticed that the light was on in the neighboring house's ground floor window. Probably the neighbor woke up in the middle of the night like I did, I thought, and went back to bed. The next morning, Ellie and I started unpacking boxes. We had a lot of work to do, so we decided to postpone meeting the neighbors for a few days. Still, while working in the yard, I noticed a man around 50 standing by the fence of the neighboring house. He was watching me without trying to hide his curiosity. "Good afternoon," I greeted, trying to start a conversation. The man didn't respond, merely nodded, and walked back into his house. It seemed odd, but I figured he might not be very sociable. Over the next few days, we noticed more strange details. Every time we went outside, the neighbor would appear in a window or on the porch, silently watching us. One evening, while Ellie and I were taking a walk around the neighborhood, we noticed that his house looked neglected, even though lights were often on inside. The lawn was overgrown with weeds, and the curtains on the windows seemed too old and dirty for such a well-kept area. Ellie began to worry. "Have you noticed that he always watches us? Sometimes I feel like he's hiding something. Maybe he's just a loner." "Don't worry, we haven't done anything to him," I tried to reassure her. But as weeks passed, the situation escalated. One evening, when I returned home from work, Ellie met me at the door. She looked frightened. I heard strange noises from his house. It sounded like someone knocking on the walls, and then, like crying. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I decided to look out the window. The neighbor's house stood dark and silent. Suddenly, I saw a shadow moving deeper into the house. It seemed like someone was walking inside. The next day, I decided to talk to another neighbor to learn more about this man. I managed to speak with an elderly woman who lived across the street. "Oh, that's Mr. Carter. He's lived here for many years," but she hesitated, looking around cautiously. "They say he changed after his wife died. He hardly talks to anyone. People find him strange, but they stay out of his business." This didn't reassure me, instead, it made me even more wary. That night, I decided to approach his house and see what was going on. Carefully, trying not to make any noise, I approached his window and peeked inside. What I saw froze me in place. The room was filled with children's toys scattered across the floor, and nearby were bloody footprints leading to another room. I stood there motionless for a few seconds until Mr. Carter suddenly entered the room. I quickly ducked and held my breath to avoid being seen. After a moment, I cautiously retreated from the house and returned home. I decided not to tell Ellie to avoid scaring her, but after what I had seen, I couldn't stay calm near this house anymore. A few days later, I noticed Mr. Carter bringing more children's toys into his house. My anxiety grew, and I decided to keep watching him. That night, around midnight, I saw him carrying the toys into the basement. He opened the door and disappeared inside, but I could hear faint sounds of crying coming from the basement. I couldn't wait any longer. The next day, I decided to approach his house during the day when Mr. Carter went to the store. Carefully, checking to make sure no one was watching, I approached his front door and tried to open it. It was locked. I walked around the house and found a small window leading to the basement. It was covered but not fully closed. I cautiously opened it and looked inside. What I saw nearly made me cry out. The basement resembled a children's playroom, but it looked eerie. Old cribs, torn toys, and on the walls were children's drawings made in red marker, or, as I dreaded to imagine, something else. In the corner of the room stood a small table with photos on it. I looked closer and realized they were photographs of children who looked terrified. At that moment, I heard footsteps from another part of the house and realized Mr. Carter had returned. I quickly escaped through the window, not even bothering to close it behind me. That night, I decided to call the police. What I had seen could no longer be ignored. But would I manage to act before Carter realized what I was doing? I decided to stop hiding the truth. The next morning, as soon as Ellie woke up, I told her everything. The strange nighttime sounds, the sound of a child crying, the toys our neighbor carried into his basement, and the bloody footprints. Her face turned pale, and she remained silent for a long time. Finally, she quietly said, "We have to do something. Call the police. This has gone too far." I agreed. We called the police and told them everything we knew. The officers arrived quickly. They interviewed us and decided to investigate the neighbor's house. I watched anxiously as they entered the yard. After a few minutes, the officers knocked on the door. The same man opened it. He looked calm, but his eyes seemed uneasy, even a bit frightened. The police explained that they had received a complaint and requested permission to search the house. Surprisingly, he agreed without hesitation. Ellie and I stood outside, waiting. About 40 minutes passed before officers began carrying out boxes filled with toys, old clothes, and some papers. They looked concerned. Shortly after, another car arrived, and investigators started examining the basement. Hours later, an officer approached us. "You did the right thing by calling us," he said. In the basement, we found more toys, notes, photographs. And something far worse. "What exactly?" Ellie asked, holding her breath. This man had been abducting children. In his house, we found evidence indicating that children had been kept there. He appears to have suffered from a condition that made him obsessed with children, likely because he never had any of his own. We believe he abducted them to create something resembling a family for himself. His words left us stunned. I felt the ground shift beneath me. One thought kept spinning in my mind: how could this happen in our quiet neighborhood? Over the next few days, the neighbor's house was surrounded by police. Investigators continued to search for evidence, and the news spread rapidly throughout the city. The neighbor was arrested. During the investigation, it was revealed that he had lived alone for over a decade. His wife had passed away many years earlier, and after her death, he gradually isolated himself from society. The police confirmed that all the abducted children had been found and returned to their families. Ellie and I couldn't recover from the shock for a long time. We decided to sell the house and move away. This incident left an unforgettable mark on our lives, reminding us how important it is to pay attention to what's happening around us. In our new home, we tried to start fresh, but every time I passed by children's toys, I was reminded of that man and his eerie house. I moved into a new neighborhood, excited to start fresh in a quiet suburban area. It was peaceful, with tree-lined streets and houses that seemed to blend in perfectly with the landscape. My new house was modest but cozy, with a large yard that gave me space to relax. The only thing that stood out was the house next door. It was old, worn down, and almost looked abandoned. The lawn was overgrown, and the windows were always closed, even in the summer. The curtains were thick, blocking any glimpse into the interior. But it wasn't just the house that stood out, it was the man who lived there. His name was Mr. Gray, and I had only ever seen him from a distance. He was always in his yard, but there was something off about him. He never spoke to anyone and always kept to himself. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he was watching the world through a foggy lens. His eyes, though, those eyes were unsettling. They never seemed to blink, and they always seemed to be looking right at you, no matter where you were. I tried to ignore it. After all, everyone has their quirks, right? But then the strange noises started. At night, I'd hear faint tapping at the walls of my house, like someone was knocking softly but persistently. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but as the nights went on, it became harder to dismiss. The tapping seemed to move, as if it was coming from different parts of the house, growing louder and more erratic. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, the feeling of being watched creeping over me. One evening, I decided to confront Mr. Gray. I had to know what was going on. I walked up to his door and rang the bell. The air around the house felt thick, like it was holding its breath. After a long pause, the door creaked open. Mr. Gray stood there, his eyes fixed on me, as if he was expecting me. "Can I help you?" he asked in a voice that was deep but raspy, like he hadn't used it in years. "I just wanted to introduce myself," I said, trying to sound friendly. "I'm your neighbor. I just moved in." He looked at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he muttered, stepping back to let me in. I hesitated, but something compelled me to step inside. The house was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a single lamp in the corner. It smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in years. There were stacks of old newspapers and books everywhere, the clutter so thick that it was hard to navigate. "Sit," Mr. Gray said, pointing to a chair across from him. His gaze never wavered, and I could feel the weight of his eyes on me as I sat down. "I don't usually get visitors," he said, almost to himself. "People don't stay long around here. They never do." I shifted uncomfortably. "What do you mean?" He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood up and walked to a window, peering out through the blinds. "You'll see," he finally said. "You'll see soon enough." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and went into another room. I sat there, unsure of what to do, when I noticed something strange. On the wall, there was a faded photograph of the neighborhood, my house, Mr. Gray's house, and several others. But the odd part was that everyone in the photo was different. They didn't look like ordinary people. Their faces were blank, as though someone had erased them. And yet, their eyes. They were the same eyes I had seen in Mr. Gray. I felt my heart race as a cold shiver ran down my spine. I stood up quickly and turned toward the door, but before I could leave, Mr. Gray appeared behind me. "Don't go," he said, his voice low and calm. "You're already a part of it." I froze. "What do you mean? What's going on here?" His expression softened, almost sympathetically. "It's been like this for years," he said. "The neighbors. They change. Over time, they change. And once they change, they don't leave. They can't." Suddenly, I understood. The strange noises, the feeling of being watched, the eerie photograph, it was all connected. I wasn't just living next to an odd neighbor. I was living next to something far worse. I backed away slowly, but Mr. Gray didn't move. "You can't leave now," he whispered. "Once you've seen it, you're part of it. The change starts soon. There's no going back." The last thing I saw before I fled his house was his eyes, staring into mine, and the faint, almost imperceptible smile that spread across his face. That night, the tapping was louder than ever. But this time, it wasn't coming from my walls. It was coming from the house next door. And as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I realized something even more terrifying. The tapping was getting closer. I couldn't sleep that night. The tapping was relentless, echoing in my head like the ticking of a clock, growing louder with each passing minute. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing. It wasn't just coming from the walls anymore, it was coming from outside, from Mr. Gray's house. As dawn broke, I mustered the courage to peek through my window. My gaze fell on the house next door. The curtains were still drawn, but something was different. There was a figure standing in the yard, staring straight at my house. The same chilling, unmoving gaze I had seen in Mr. Gray the night before. It wasn't just him, though. There were other figures behind him, shapes, shadowy and indistinct, blending into the darkness of the yard. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was imagining things. But when I looked again, the figures were still there. Watching. I couldn't stay in that house another minute. I grabbed my things in a panic and headed out, but before I could reach the door, I heard it, the unmistakable creak of the floorboards behind me. I froze, heart in my throat, and turned slowly. There, standing in the doorway, was Mr. Gray. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried a heavy sense of finality. His eyes were wide now, unnaturally so, almost too large for his face. They glowed faintly in the dim light of the room. I backed away, my legs shaking, but he didn't move. He simply watched me, and as he did, the air in the room grew colder. It wasn't the kind of cold you could feel, it was the kind that settled deep inside you, a bone-chilling cold that made every inch of your skin crawl. "You've already seen too much," he murmured. "Now, you're part of it." "Part of what?" I managed to croak, my throat dry as sandpaper. "What are you talking about?" Mr. Gray's lips twisted into a smile, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was thin, almost predatory. "You're seeing things that aren't meant to be seen. The house. The neighborhood. It's not what you think." I tried to make a run for it, but the moment my foot stepped forward, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as though an invisible force was holding me back. I gasped, unable to move. It felt like my very breath was being stolen from me. "You can't escape now," he said softly. "Once you've seen the change, it's too late. You'll never leave." I tried to scream, but my voice was trapped, my words silenced in the air. My vision blurred, and the walls of the house seemed to close in on me. It felt like the whole world was pressing in from all sides. And then, just as quickly as it started, the pressure vanished. I stumbled, disoriented, into the living room. The house was silent again, the tapping from outside gone. But the strange, suffocating feeling remained, like I was no longer alone in the room. I turned, and there, standing in the corner, was a figure I hadn't seen before. It was tall, gaunt, with hollowed-out eyes, its face obscured by a dark hood. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like a weight in the air. "What are you?" I whispered, but the figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand, pointing toward the front door. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted, running out of the house and into the street. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the air thick with an unshakable sense of dread. As I ran, I glanced over my shoulder. There, at the edge of the street, was Mr. Gray. But he wasn't alone. The other figures from his yard were there too, slowly moving toward me, their hollow eyes fixed on my every step. I kept running, my legs aching, but no matter how fast I moved, they were always there, just behind me. I reached the end of the street, gasping for air, and turned to see how far they were. But when I looked, they had stopped. They stood in the middle of the road, unmoving, like statues. And then, to my horror, I saw it. The figures were no longer just shadows. They had taken on shape, human shape, but twisted. Their faces were pale and lifeless, their features contorted in unnatural ways. Their eyes, those same eyes, were wide and staring, unblinking. I backed away, horrified, but one of them stepped forward. It was Mr. Gray. "You can't escape," he repeated, his voice now cold and hollow. "You're one of us now." I turned and ran again, but the world around me seemed to distort. The street seemed longer, the houses shifting, the road stretching into an endless void. The once familiar neighborhood had become something else, something darker, something wrong. And as I ran, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't running away from them. I was running in circles, trapped in the same place. The change had already begun. And now, there was no way out. I ran, my breath ragged, but every turn I took only led me back to the same street, the same houses. It felt like the world had warped into a nightmare, a looping maze where I was both the prey and the hunter, always just one step behind my own escape. The air grew heavier, thicker with each breath, and the distant hum of the world outside my neighborhood faded, like the very fabric of reality was starting to crumble. I looked behind me, and there they were again, Mr. Gray and the figures. They hadn't moved, not a single inch. But their eyes, those eyes, tracked me with eerie precision, as if they were drawing me closer without lifting a finger. "You're never getting out," Mr. Gray's voice echoed through the stillness, a rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere. "You're part of this place now, part of the pattern." I could feel the walls of the world closing in on me, but my legs kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest like it might explode. The ground beneath my feet seemed to change with every step, as if the earth itself was shifting, pulling me into a different dimension, a place where time didn't matter, where escape was a fantasy. I stopped for a moment, gasping for air, my hands on my knees. I had to think. I couldn't just keep running in circles. There had to be a way out. But every option felt wrong, like the very space around me was alive, pressing in, suffocating me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a flicker of movement near the end of the street. A figure, standing by the shadows of the trees. It wasn't like the others. It wasn't twisted or faceless. It was a person, a woman, with dark hair and a calm expression, standing still like she had been waiting for me. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to keep running, but something about her felt different. Safe, almost. She stepped forward slowly, and I found myself compelled to follow her, drawn in by an invisible force. "Come," she said softly, her voice gentle. "I can help you." The words, so simple, felt like a lifeline in the middle of my panic. Without thinking, I started toward her, the sound of Mr. Gray's voice growing fainter in the distance. When I reached her, she turned and began walking toward the trees, her steps light and swift. I followed without question, trusting her, even though every rational thought screamed at me to be cautious. As we moved deeper into the shadows, the air seemed to shift. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, though I could still feel the chill on my skin. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling with fear. "I'm someone who's been here longer than you," she replied, her tone steady. "And someone who can help you leave." I almost laughed out of desperation. "Leave? How? I've been running in circles. There's no way out." She stopped abruptly and turned to face me, her eyes filled with an odd, knowing sorrow. "There is always a way out. But you have to understand what you're up against." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" She nodded toward the street, where Mr. Gray and the others were now nothing more than distant figures, watching from the shadows. "They are part of something ancient. This place, this neighborhood, it's a prison, a place where people are trapped. And the ones who live here are not like you. Not anymore." I felt a coldness creep up my spine. "What happened to them?" Her eyes hardened. "They've changed. They've become part of the pattern. And once you're in it, you don't leave. Not without making a sacrifice." I recoiled. Sacrifice? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at her feet, a faint sadness clouding her face. "The only way to leave this place is to take someone else's place. Someone else has to replace you, or you're trapped forever." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "So I have to kill someone?" She didn't flinch. "No. You don't have to kill anyone. But someone else must willingly take your place. You can't leave without that agreement." I shook my head in disbelief. "Why didn't you leave, then? Why are you still here?" Her expression darkened, a flicker of regret crossing her face. "I've been trying to find someone who can replace me. I've been waiting. But they're all too afraid. No one dares to make the choice." I took a step back. The gravity of the situation was starting to sink in. I was trapped, and the only way out was to convince someone else to take my place, to live in this twisted world of never-ending loops. But who? Who could I ask to sacrifice everything just so I could escape? "Are you going to do it?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Are you going to find someone? Or will you remain here, just another face in the crowd of the changed?" I looked back at the neighborhood, at the figures standing silently in the distance. They were waiting, watching, but they weren't just waiting for me. They were waiting for anyone. Anyone who might slip up, who might let fear take over. I realized then that there was no escape without that sacrifice. And I had no choice but to make it. The question was, who? The weight of the decision pressed on me like 1,000 tons, each breath I took heavier than the last. The woman's words echoed in my mind, the reality of my situation finally sinking in. I had no choice but to find someone else, someone who would willingly take my place, or I would be trapped here forever, just another lost soul in a neighborhood where escape was a forgotten dream. But the thought of asking anyone to step into this nightmare, to make that sacrifice, felt impossible. How could I do that to someone? How could I even begin to explain the horrors of this place without sounding insane? I turned to the woman, her eyes waiting, expectant. She had once been like me, full of hope and desperation, but now she was nothing more than a hollow shell, forever bound to this cursed neighborhood. "I can't," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I can't ask anyone to do that." She nodded, as if she already knew. "Then you'll stay here. Just like all the others who couldn't make the choice." I felt a cold shiver run through me. It was as if the walls of the world were closing in tighter, the air growing thicker with every passing second. The neighborhood had already changed me in ways I couldn't understand, and I was afraid that if I didn't make the decision soon, I would lose everything. My identity. My memories. My very soul. "I'm sorry," I said, more to myself than to her. "I don't know if I can do this." The woman's face softened, a sad, knowing look in her eyes. "You don't have to make the choice right now. But you will have to choose. Eventually. Time doesn't work like it used to in this place. It will catch up with you, even if you try to outrun it." I stared at her, at the darkness of the trees beyond us, the creeping feeling that time itself was slipping away. I didn't want to stay here. I didn't want to be one of them. But how could I force someone else to endure what I had gone through? Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a sharp crack, like the sound of a branch snapping in half. I spun around, my heart racing. There, standing at the edge of the shadows, was Mr. Gray, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You've made your choice," he said, his voice cold and distant. "You won't be leaving until someone else replaces you. If you won't make the choice yourself, we'll make it for you." The figures behind him stepped forward, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their movements slow and deliberate. I felt the air grow colder, heavier. They were coming closer, surrounding me. The neighborhood was closing in, trapping me in a prison of my own making. But then, something shifted. The woman beside me stepped forward, her hand raised, blocking their path. She turned to face me, her expression hardening. "I'll do it," she said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "I'll take your place." I stared at her in shock. "No. You can't. I won't let you." But she shook her head, her eyes calm and steady. "You've been running from this place long enough. It's time for someone to make the sacrifice. If I can spare you from this, I will. This is the only way." Before I could protest, she turned to face Mr. Gray and the others. She nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. The figures stepped back, and for the first time since I had arrived in this cursed place, the oppressive weight lifted, even if just slightly. The woman turned to me once more, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "But this is the only way." With that, she turned and walked toward the shadows, her form fading into the darkness. The figures surrounded her, their hollow eyes following her every step, and for the first time, I realized I was free. I had escaped. But at what cost? As the neighborhood around me shifted, I could feel the pull of something deep within the ground, something ancient and unyielding, claiming its prize. The woman was gone. The neighborhood had claimed her, and I was left standing, alone, in the quiet aftermath of her sacrifice. I took one last look at the twisted houses and the figures still lurking in the shadows, and then I walked away. The road ahead seemed endless, but at least it was mine to walk. The change had been made. And the neighborhood, for now, would be silent. But I knew deep down that the pattern was far from over. And someday, someone else would come, someone else who would face the same choice I had.